John Gower is a former commander of two British submarines and former Assistant Chief of Defense Staff on Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological for the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense. Hi, John.
Yeah, good afternoon, Dana. Good to see you again.
Let's start with really what is dominating the headlines today, if you will allow me, and that is that Russia's President Putin has announced that he will station nuclear tactical weapons in Belarus. How significant a threat, and to who exactly?
Well, it is a significant move, but it isn't a significant increase in threat, to be honest. What it is, it's a continuation of the dangerous nuclear posturing that he has conducted around the invasion of Ukraine. These weapons should not be in Belarus. When the Soviet Union broke up, the former Soviet Union states that gained independence returned those that had Soviet nuclear weapons on their soil, returned often with the assistance of the US Nunn-Lugar program, returned these weapons back to Russia as the kernel of the Soviet Union, and made declarations, and many of them signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear weapon states. They made declarations they wished to be non-nuclear weapon states and retain this. So this is Belarus reneging on that as a state. It is also because these were not that had happened after the NPT had signed. The placing of them is not equivalent to the NATO weapons that the US has in a number of NATO nations which pre-existed the NPT. So there's also an NPT violation. But those are sort of legal arguments. What this is really is high provocation by Putin. He has ostensibly linked this to the UK's position on giving or selling to Ukraine Challenger tanks armed with depleted uranium armor-piercing shells, and he has somehow conflated depleted uranium, which is about piercing armor, with nuclear weapons. This is, of course, ludicrous, and is another bit of misinformation that has been the solid story throughout the Ukraine illegal invasion.
Okay, you've covered a lot of ground here. So if you don't mind, if I can backtrack on a couple of things. First of all, in terms of the spent uranium shells that are being supplied with the British tanks, they are, of course, not nuclear, although Putin seems to have hinted that they are. But how would you gauge the risk of deployment of these shells, which have been used elsewhere, including by the US military? What is the risk of deployment to Russian soldiers exactly? Because that's the flag, maybe a false flag, that Putin has raised.
Well, the risk to Russian soldiers and tanks is high. These are incredibly effective anti-tank weapons. They penetrate the armor very effectively and at long range. That's the reason why the depleted uranium is added to the shell tip, is in order to gain penetration. There are some minor radioactivity issues with depleted uranium on the battleground. They were seen in the Gulf War, where both the UK and the US used DU shells in the tank battles in the first war around Kuwait, and again in 2003. But that is deemed an acceptable. I mean, there's many other things in a battlefield that are noxious and dangerous and poisonous, and a battlefield is not a good place to be. But these are not nuclear weapons in any sense of the term. When you talk about nuclear weapons, you talk about a fission taking place with a large and rapid release of energy. There's no fission involved in depleted uranium shells. This is it's the equivalent, if you like, at throwing very high speed a medical source that you use. I mean, it's totally different. And therefore, any equivalence between a nuclear weapon and depleted uranium is, as I said, ludicrous.
Putin has referred to the fact that since the 1950s, and it's important people understand how long they've been there, that America has lent or placed strategically bombs which are nuclear bombs, in European countries, some European countries, and they've rotated them around. They were in Turkey, they're in Italy, they're in Germany, and elsewhere, to reassure allies that if there was going to be an East-West conflict and they were going to be attacked, that there would be a nuclear response from those countries, so they wouldn't have to develop their own nuclear programs. You know, if I'm correct in saying that. Is there a parallel with him placing nuclear weapons in Belarus and the fact that the U.S. has, for more than half a century, had a limited number of nuclear bombs with its allies in Europe?
Well, I mean, firstly, it's important to remember, if you go back as far as the 1950s, that it wasn't just the US that placed nuclear weapons in Europe. All three of the nuclear weapon states that joined the NATO alliance had nuclear weapons in Europe. In those days, nuclear weapons peppered every part of the tactical battlefield, whether you were in the air, on the ground, artillery shells. And so you really need to look at the mid-70s onwards, because that's when everyone woke up and we started having arms limitation talks. We started to reduce the number of weapons, and all of those other weapons melted away. So the UK and France, UK has no weapons other than its Trident missile. France only has its two strategic elements, which is the missiles in its submarines and its aerial component. And the US withdrew all of its cruise missiles, its bombs, its rockets. The INF Treaty was part of this. There was a massive reduction in nuclear weapons in Europe. And the only ones that remained were the weapons that were carried before the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was conceived by a certain number of partners in NATO for basically a couple of reasons. Firstly was reassurance, and secondly was about burden sharing. It was about saying that NATO is a nuclear alliance. It's still a nuclear alliance. It was conceived as a nuclear alliance. Whilst nuclear weapons remain, it will continue to be so. And that the nations who were not nuclear weapon states should not necessarily simply rest on the nuclear weapons of the three NATO nations who are. And so burden sharing, in other words, a collective sharing of the decision, is natural because NATO works on consensus, but also a collective sharing of the use of these nuclear weapons. In other words, the US bombs, which sit in a number of countries, and I won't confirm or deny names of those countries, they would be taken into the air by aircraft operated by the airmen, by the air forces of those countries, under what would become a dual key arrangement. Both the country launching them and the country delivering them, the US, would be involved. And that was taken into account in the drawing up of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And at the time, so did Russia, or rather the Soviet Union, have weapons in satellite states within the Warsaw Pact. As I said earlier, when the Soviet Union broke up in the late 80s, early 90s, all of those countries wanted rid of the Soviet nuclear weapons that were in them, including Belarus, Ukraine, there were many of the satellite states, Kazakhstan. They all had not only nuclear weapons, but biological and chemical facilities. And the Nunn-Lugar program, cooperative program, threat reduction program that the US instigated and funded at huge expense, assisted these countries in returning and dismantling the weapons of mass destruction infrastructure that the Soviet Union had placed upon them. But with that came the responsibility to be a non-nuclear weapon state. And it was a responsibility that they all chose, and one that Belarus is reneging on if it takes nuclear weapons back into its fold. So at the most basic level, you could draw an equivalence, but whenever you look at it in any detail, that equivalence is false. And the point of this, from Putin's perspective, is not to gain equivalence. That's his justification. It's about reinforcing the nuclearization of his illegal war in Ukraine. It's about encircling Ukraine with, again, with weapons. And let's not forget, he's also had a plan for a long time to place tactical nuclear weapons in the Kaliningrad pocket, which is west of the eastern borders of Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and that little pocket in the corner of the Baltic states. Now, it takes a long time to construct the vaults in which such weapons need to be carried, because those vaults, as the US ones are operated by the owner country as a sort of mini embassy, and it's US owned land, and they are the only ones who have access to the weapons until, heaven forfend, they're ever used. There is some doubt as to whether those vaults have actually even been constructed in Kaliningrad. And I know that President Putin has talked about July as a time to have built those vaults, but there's no indication yet that they're being built. These are not things that you can quietly build. They will be spotted. So it's rhetoric at the moment, but it's dangerous rhetoric.
So the timing of this seems to be that he's saying that they'll be in Belarus pretty quickly. I mean, Kaliningrad, as you mentioned, the more than 7 years they've been talking about building some of the infrastructure there to hold nuclear weapons, and it's still not complete. Putin's talking about tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus by the summer, which, a lot of people think is wishful thinking, but isn't the timing of the rhetoric designed to coincide with the expectation by the Russians that that's when the Ukrainians will launch this counterstrike and potentially go for the Crimea?
Well, I wouldn't speak about the Crimea, but certainly all indications are that the Ukrainians have contained the latest onslaught, in particular around Bakhmut and other places, and there's a lot of talk about a counteroffensive. So this is Russia continuing to use, or Putin in particular, continuing to use nuclear weapons as a tool of intimidation, which is illegal, threatening the use of nuclear weapons, except in response to other nuclear weapons. The UCJ remarked in the 90s what would be an illegal act, and has stepped up nuclear exercises. So throughout the Ukrainian war that they instigated illegally, they and Putin in particular has been both implicit and explicit that nuclear weapons stand on the edge of this, and he has linked the fight in Ukraine rather ridiculously and dangerously to the survival of the Russian state, which is the sort of language that is used by nuclear weapon states when they think about the extreme circumstances in which they may use nuclear weapons. Now, I don't believe that Putin has yet crossed that Rubicon in his mind. I don't believe he would be so stupid so to do, but his language is worrying, and this indication of this act is an escalation in that rhetoric. Now, commentators and officials in the US and in NATO have all said recently that this is intimidating, it is reckless, but it will not change the calculations that they currently have. I mean, those weapons exist in Russia. They will exist in Belarus. They'll be deterred and dealt with in the same way where they are. But there is no doubt that the moving of them towards Poland, towards the eastern edge of the NATO nations, is provocative and destabilizing, and should be condemned. And as I've tried to explain, on the very, very, very basic level, you could make a case for some sort of equivalence, but that argument falls apart under any realistic scrutiny.
Putin makes these comments about tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus and speaks out against the spent uranium shells that could be deployed by Ukraine. During the conclusion of his meetings with President Xi of China in Moscow, and then within days of that also, where he talked about Belarus. China, ironically, has been saying, they are part of their so-called peace plan, is that nobody should deploy nuclear weapons, nobody should threaten nuclear power plants. And this takes place just while on a parallel track, you have Britain and America stepping forward to supply nuclear submarines to Australia. You have written that you're in favor of the so-called AUKUS deal, or a deal that's also been called Pillar One. Why would you do so if all we're seeing is escalating rhetoric and now deployment of nuclear weapons around the world?
Well, let's be absolutely clear, because the use of the word nuclear gets conflated by everyone, and you sort of did it a little yourself there.
I confess, because a nuclear weapon and a nuclear-powered submarine are different.
We're talking about two totally different things. The conversation we have just had, and I'd like to just touch on the Chinese peace plan here, because that is the link. The problem with the Chinese peace plan is it starts off with an equivalence of fault, if I can simplify it. It is passive on who started what. It just says, we've got this war, let's stop it. Well, that, of course, is ridiculous, because there's an understanding why China has said that. But given China's no first use policy and its very strong position on that in nuclear weapons, it is very strange that China has not condemned the nuclear rhetoric from Putin more. Well, it's strange on the one hand because it's illogical. It's not strange when you look at the geopolitical position. So I think calling the Chinese a peace plan is insulting to the start of this war. It is a negotiated plan, and I think the reason that Western nations continue to support Ukraine directly is because of the false start. But we need to separate the discussion we've just had on nuclear weapons from nuclear-powered submarines. The nuclear bit in the submarines is just a propulsion issue. There are no nuclear weapons, absolutely no nuclear weapons involved in AUKUS. And the submarine deal is the first pillar of the AUKUS agreement that was announced in 2021. The others is further cooperation in intelligence and other activities, which have probably a slightly shorter time frame, much shorter time frame, but are less articulated in the public domain than the submarine deal.
Right, but China would say that nuclear submarines to Australia is an element of nuclear proliferation, and they have raised those concerns.
They would say that because they're predominantly worried about the threat or the counter it places is to their very strong desire to achieve hegemony over what is called South China Sea. Personally, I think we should remove all country names from seas and oceans, and we should go for things like Mediterranean, Pacific, and Atlantic, because the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea and the Korean Sea and the Sea of Japan implies a sense of ownership over international waters which are deliberately not owned. And so that's just my personal beef. It's not going to happen. UNCLOS isn't going to make that happen. But China is definitely seeking a sway of control over a vast sway of waters, both international and owned by other countries. And we've seen in the Paracels and the Spratlys where they have been constructing islands for forward basing their units, and their nuclear submarines are patrolling ever further and operating ever further into this Chinese intended hegemonic sphere of influence.
So what do these submarines do, John? I mean, what is the point of giving Australia nuclear-powered submarines? How does that, become a counterweight to an aggressive China?
Well, Australia already has capable conventional submarines in the Collins class, and they patrol north towards areas where Australia and the US and other countries in various alliances feel they need to have a presence. So firstly, and the nuclear submarine, the nuclear propulsion plant in the submarine allows longer duration patrols and further from Australia. And at the moment, those more penetrative patrols into international waters that China seeks to control are conducted intermittently by UK deployments of an SSN on a global deployment, and almost continuously by the US submarines of the Pacific Fleet based out of Pearl Harbor and Guam.
Okay.
So what AUKUS does is it provides a third leg to that triad. The agreement is of a shared need to counter this particular threat from China and from other countries, but it's predominantly China. And it provides in the medium term, I mean, we're talking probably the late 2030s, early 2040s for the specifically designed AUKUS submarines to enter Australian service. But the announcement in San Diego earlier this month also included an announcement that the US would offer and Australia would seek to take over some Virginia-class SSNs when their ability to do so, which is both infrastructure, training, and personnel numbers, allowed them to do so. So there'll be an interim phase where Australia is operating Virginia-class SSNs retired from the United States Navy, and then will operate what's been termed in the announcement the AUKUS SSN, which will be built
also nuclear, the Virginia.
The Virginia also nuclear. Yeah, SSN, the N bit of the SSN means nuclear. So S just means ship submerged nuclear. So SSN is a nuclear submarine. And SSK, because we spell conventional with a K if we're in NATO, is a conventional submarine. But yeah, as soon as you have an N, it's a nuclear powered submarine. And if you were to put a B in there, it would be a ballistic missile nuclear powered submarine. But those are not what are being sold. So the Australians will operate some American SSNs, nuclear submarines, and then some Austro-British, if you like. The design that was announced out of the San Diego announcement was fundamentally the British submarine that replaced the Astute class, the current class in the Royal Navy, would be a joint design with the Australians to meet both requirements and would have significant technological injects from the US to make it a better boat.
Okay, nuclear power plants, longer range, but no nuclear weapons on board those submarines.
None whatsoever.
Why is that important?
It is important for several reasons. Firstly, is that would be a breach of a proliferation treaty. Secondly, Australia is not a nuclear weapon state, doesn't want to be. In fact, it's the anathema politically. It would never happen. And
by the way, since you raised it, because you just triggered, I didn't realize until reading up for our interview that in fact, any American or British nuclear submarines that are armed with nuclear weapons are not even allowed to make port in Australia.
No, they're not. And nor are any ships or submarines that will not declare that they don't have nuclear weapons, if you see what I mean. Now, so if you go back in time, when British ships until the mid-90s, roughly 1994, British ships carried nuclear weapons collectively. Every frigate and above had nuclear weapons as part of the NATO policy, which I referred to earlier. And we retired all of these in the 90s and came to a single weapon. During the period that those ships carried weapons, I mean, they were capable of carrying, sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. We had a policy of neither confirming nor denying whether any ship at any one time had any weapons, and none of our ships with that policy could visit Australian ports. Okay. Now, we still technically have that policy, but we say we can neither confirm nor deny, but we only have Trident missiles and you couldn't fit one on this ship. So you know, so they visit. But there's a serious, so that's a sort of slightly anecdotal, but there's a serious side to this because, as I say in a paper, the second paper I've written on AUKUS, which was published by the Asia Pacific Leadership Network on the 24th of March, so on Friday, the US plan, which was conceived in the previous administration under President Trump and has not yet been formally broken by the administration here, is to reinstitute a submarine-launched cruise missile. When the Tomahawk, which is a land attack missile carried and regularly used, a conventional land attack missile, came into being in the 1990s, I think, early 1990s it came into being. The US produced a nuclear-armed variant of that submarine, of that missile. And it was called the TLAM-N, the Tomahawk Land Attack Missile (nuclear). It was retired under the presidency of President Clinton, and they've been in storage and are being dismantled now. The Americans
and supposedly the Russians also took nuclear-tipped cruise missiles off their submarines, or at one point there wasn't a formal agreement, but they had said that they would not deploy with nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, correct?
Well, although they were not covered by the INF treaty because that dealt with land-launched weapons only, there was a sort of tacit agreement that they would be removed, but they have been put back in Russian submarines, and President Putin has made a thing of that. The caliber cruise missiles carried by modern Russian submarines have a nuclear capability. But
so why do you, ahead, why do you support AUKUS?
Well,
because
China.
But let me finish the question. You support it,
yeah,
but you do not support any of those submarines that will be supplied to Australia to have cruise missiles on board. Why?
No, I don't. No, let me be clear. Part of the AUKUS agreement is that the Australians, like the British have done, will buy the conventionally armed Tomahawk land attack missile to form part of the armament of those submarines. And those missiles have been used. They were used in the actions supporting the former Yugoslavia. They have been used in all of the conflicts in the Gulf, and they are a very credible means of treating air command and control to allow forces to in the early stages of a war. They're a legitimate part of a war. So as planned, there will be submarines, conventionally armed submarines of the Australian Navy, the Royal Navy, and the American and the US Navy operating in the Pacific, armed with these conventional weapons. Now, the thing is that submarines are flagless when they're dived, and a missile, as it rises out of the ocean, doesn't tell you what it's got in its nose. So at the moment, you can be absolutely certain, were you China, i.e., or India, because they're close, the nuclear-armed states of the East, of the Western Pacific, can be confident that if a missile comes out and it's not a ballistic missile, it isn't nuclear. So they don't need to worry about it being nuclear. If, however, America chooses to reintroduce into any of its SSNs the capability for that missile to be armed with a nuclear warhead, that taints immediately all three nations, even though two of them will never field that weapon, because you can't tell which submarine has fired it. And so all of those nations will be constrained, either politically or specifically, from using the conventional weapons in any way, in any form of combat that could be misconstrued by China to be a nuclear launch. It would be
you have just set the stage, or you've explained it very well. You've set the stage for a possible mistake, a critical mistake, where there could be a nuclear exchange based on the fact that somebody's launched a cruise missile that the other side, whatever that conflict will be, may deem a nuclear threat, even though it may not be one.
That potential already exists. I'm just saying that this adds one in the submarine dimension. That potential already exists because Russia has dual capable weapons, and America and France have dual capable weapons in that they launch cruise missiles from the air that can be either conventionally or nuclear armed. So I'm just saying that, and that is why I and others have been campaigning for many years to ban nuclear cruise missiles or any weapon that is dual capable, because of this miscalculation, misinterpretation risk. Because in a conventional war, at the moment, we haven't had, until Ukraine started by Russia, we haven't had a conventional war that's involved nuclear armed states. We've had nuclear armed states fighting conventional wars against non-nuclear armed states, no risk of miscalculation. Mm-hmm. At the moment, we have a conventionally armed Ukraine fighting a nuclear-armed Russia. And no one is suggesting at all that anything going to Ukraine, other than President Putin, who has conflated depleted uranium shells with nuclear weapons because disinformation, No one is suggesting anything like placing anything that even looks or smells like a nuclear weapon anywhere near Ukraine. So that in itself is not a problem. But as soon as you have nuclear armed states, and in particular the US and the UK, if the US fields a submarine launched cruise missile that has a nuclear capability, it emasculates not only the US conventional submarine launched land attack missiles, but also those of Australia and the UK and it would be an own goal of monumental proportions, because such weapons, frankly, add no appreciable gain to America's national security, given the rest of their arsenal in the nuclear world, and add to this miscalculation and misinterpretation risk, which already exists with other cruise missiles, but it would simply just add another dimension of risk.
John Gower, former Rear Admiral for the UK Ministry of Defence. John, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.